hearing from our next keynote speaker. His name is Jack Bobo. He is a senior vice president and the chief communications officer for one of the first, if not the only, pure play biotechnology company in America today. Fascinating technology, fascinating stories. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Bobo to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks. We got the microphone on. You guys can hear me? So I'm not really going to talk to you too much about my company. I'm going to talk to you more about what I did before I joined my company. I spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of State doing global food policy and traveled to about 50 or 60 countries talking about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we talk to people. And it was a really great job. I enjoyed it. But every place I went, I would show up and I would say, and they would introduce me and say, this is Jack Bobo from the Department of Agriculture. And I would have to explain, no, I'm not actually from USDA. I'm from the State Department. And we do food and ag too. And they'd say, well, what's the difference between what you do at the State Department and what they do at USDA? And I say, well, that's easy. At USDA, they do things. At the State Department, we talk about doing things. And so, fortunately for you, I'm talking about things that other people are doing. I will give you a little overview of our company. Some of you probably already know. How many people in the room have heard of Intrexon? Some, not many. I'm head of communications, very disappointing in me. This isn't live streamed, right? So quickly, how many of you have heard of the Aqua Bounty salmon, the fast-growing GMO salmon? That's one, we're a majority shareholder of that company. What about the Arctic apple, the non-browning GMO apple? More people, we own that as well. Okanagan Specialty Fruits. They were in stores in the fall last year, and we'll have even more of those out this year. Transova Genetics, any folks in here working in dairy and livestock? That's one of our companies as well. That's one of these great Iowa companies in northwest Iowa. And we also do the genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Zika. So that's who we are. That's what I do as my day job. But I'm really here to talk to you about the question of, can agriculture save the planet before it destroys it? Because in many ways, there is nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture. But there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge that we have is, how do we maintain and grow the benefits and reduce the negatives? So I'll give you some examples. If we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth is already being used for agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So the good news for you guys is we're not making any more agricultural land. And so in the future, we're going to have to achieve all of our goals on the same amount or less land, because a lot of that is already highly degraded today. So there's nothing bigger than agriculture in terms of land. If we were to talk about water, this is the Aral Sea back in 1973. And if you fast forward to today, what you find is that it's not really a sea at all. And that's largely because of agricultural withdrawals of water. So as you probably know, 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. And here we have the Colorado River, the 6th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these aren't the challenges of 2050, these are the realities of today. So these are the things that we have to deal with. So there's nothing bigger than ag in terms of water as well. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture directly. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. Now that's almost as much as energy, and it's more than anything else. But here's what's interesting. For every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now those are critical long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world. Positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? And what I know of most Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that because I'm not with the government anymore. So in terms of land, water, climate, there's just nothing more important than agriculture. But if you look at what the media is talking about in terms of climate, 90% is about ag policy, or is about energy policy, virtually nothing about ag. So there's a real conversation that's not being had about the importance of agriculture. Now you all know we're going from 7 billion people today to 9.5 billion people by 2050. You're thinking about that every day. But we also have about 9 million people that are, well, we have 800 million people that are going to go to bed hungry tonight. That's a huge challenge. It's a challenge for lots of reasons, though. We have 800 million people, but we also have 9 million people that are dying of hunger every year. So that's more than HIV, road accidents, malaria. You add all these other things up that are in the news, and they're still less than hunger. And I think part of the problem is that 9 million is a really big number, and it's hard for people to wrap their minds around that. So think about it this way. Today, 25,000 people are going to die of hunger. In the next hour, 1,000 people are going to die of hunger. That's one person every 4 seconds. How do we get people to recognize that that one person, that one child, is meaningful and not focus on this 9 million number that doesn't mean anything? How do we get people to care? That's one of the challenges we have. Because agriculture has delivered over time. We need 60 to 100% more food, but we need to do it using less land, less water, and less inputs. So we have to do everything better tomorrow than we're doing it today, and our rivers and lakes are running dry. So those are challenges that we all face. But innovation in agriculture is a bright spot. It's something that should be exciting to all of us. So what has agriculture delivered? And this is what's interesting to me, is because when you ask people, what do you think about agriculture? They often say that it's going in the wrong direction, that it's bad and it could get worse. And that's because they look at the challenges of today and they don't look at where we've come from. So if we were to look at how many resources were necessary to produce a bushel of corn between 1980 and 2011, what would we find? We'd find that farmers are using 35% fewer greenhouse gases, are delivering. They're 40% less land to produce that bushel of corn. We've got 40% less energy, 50% less water, and 60% less erosion on that land. So farmers are doing everything better than they were in the past, but we're producing so much more that there's still challenges. So the question isn't, are things getting bad, or they're bad and they're getting worse? They're getting good, but are they getting good fast enough? That's the challenge, is things getting good fast enough and people understanding that story of agriculture. Because right now we have these two competing views of how our food system should work. We have a slow food movement that says we should produce our food the way it was produced 100 years ago. And we have this high-tech version that says we need to do it faster, smarter, more inputs, less land. So we have these two competing forces, and yet they're moving forward and they could collide. Because if I can choose what goes on my local label, how can I trade it globally? So we've got a challenge, and we need to make sure that these two important threads come together in order to make our food system better and stronger. I like to say that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And that's a challenge for all of us, because they care about it and they think they know about it, and they're asking for changes based on what they think rather than what is actually the case. I also like to point out that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And look, there is no place they despise change more than the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together as family, our friends. It pulls us together around the table. You break bread together. If you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. It's not surprising that these things make people concerned. So again, we have to figure out, when do people like innovation and when do people dislike change? How do we talk about it? Because it's really more about choices and consequences. And I'll give you the example of Europe. So over the next decade, according to the OECD, Europe will increase its agricultural production by just under 4%, just ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, demand in Europe will increase much faster than that. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to purchase that food from someplace else. So in Brazil, their increase in production will be about 40% over the next decade. So think about that. Europe is exporting its agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. It's about choices and consequences. Europeans can afford not to produce that food, and as a result, somebody else will. It's a lot of farmers in the Midwest, but it's also farmers in Brazil and other places. So how do we talk about this? Because the choices that are made in one place have big impacts on all of us. So it's also how companies are communicating food and agriculture. Because if you look at this bottle, one of the things I like is that it's non-GMO and gluten-free. You can imagine the advertising guy when he's talking to the scientists and he said, what, our water doesn't have gluten in it? We've got to be marketing that. And the scientist is like, it's water. And he's like, yeah, and it doesn't have any gluten. And they're thinking, this is a marketing advantage. We can own the space of gluten-free water. And that's a problem, though, because the company doesn't really believe that their product is better than other products because of that label. But the problem we have is that when the public has a false belief, it's easier to cater to that belief than to try to eradicate it. So companies aren't even trying to deal with people's misperceptions, they're trying to take advantage of it. And what that does is it undermines confidence in the entire food system. Because at some point somebody comes along and says, well, I've been spending $4 for gluten-free water and it's the same as my tap water. And they feel like they've been lied to and misled, and then they just don't trust companies that are producing these products, and they don't trust anybody in the food system. So we're undermining confidence in our own system. Now, if you look at the product here, it conveys a vision of how our agriculture system works. You've got these beautiful farms and barns and fields as the animals are led to slaughter. Now, I don't know about you, but this is dog food. And I am not sure the dogs really care what the packaging looks like. But it's conveying a vision of what our agricultural system looks like that may not be consistent with reality. And then we get upset with consumers for not understanding how food is produced. Well, if you market one version of reality, how can you be surprised if they actually think that's true? So we have to sort of own some of the responsibility for how consumers are thinking about food. But a lot of this has led to skeptical consumers who just don't trust the food system. They like farmers, but they don't like farming. They don't like big food, they like small food until it becomes big food, and then they don't like it again. And so these are all challenges that we have. People are undermining confidence in our system. So it's less about having a failure of innovation, and it's more about a failure of communication. Now, I spent a lot of time at the State Department talking about risk. And I like science, so I spent a lot of time trying to explain to people the difference between hazard and exposure and risk. And so I'd work really hard at this, and I would say, well, let me give you an example. A plane crash is a really big hazard, but your exposure is low, and that's why you're here. On the other hand, a car crash is a much smaller hazard, but our exposure is higher, and that's why people say it's more dangerous to drive than to fly. Doesn't matter. We're hardwired to understand hazards. We are not hardwired to understand risk, unless you're a statistician, and nobody likes those guys, right? No, I'm kidding. I'm going to come back to the statisticians later. So that's a problem, though, is that people don't understand what risk really means. So eventually, I realized that what I should be talking about is hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And that's what we're mostly dealing with. People worry about what they're told to worry about. How could it be any different? So today what we have is the tweetification of risk. Somebody hears some crazy thing, they tweet it to their friends, who tweet it to their friends, and it's halfway around the world before you know it. And so we have to understand, but we also have to be part of this conversation. And a lot of people in this room are probably not part of social media. I've been looking at the tweets, there are some, but if I were at a university giving this talk, it would just be a running stream of commentary. He's crazy, I don't like this guy, who put him up here? That's fine, I've got a thick skin, I've got kids. But if you're not part of the conversation, you can't be surprised if the conversation doesn't go the direction you want it to. So when should we communicate? Now, when I was in the government, we all understood that when the risk is high and media attention is low, we should participate, like during flu season. But what about when the risk is low and media attention is high? Is that a risk or is it not a risk? Well, at FDA and other places, they'd probably say, well, that's not a real risk. But if people think it's a risk, and they ask for policy changes because they think it's a risk, and our entire food system changes because they think it's a risk, I guarantee you that is a risk. And so largely governments and others have just not been part of a conversation. They need to be. Well, there's also a question, what should we talk about? Well, The sad thing is, if you had looked at my talking points when I was working with the government, I would have said we're trying to feed the world, scientists say it's safe, all of these things. These are all things that turn people off. It is sad because science, at the beginning of a conversation, just polarizes the audience. If you lead with science, you will lose with science. So if you lead with science, what you find is those who agree with you more, and those who disagree more. So that's a challenge because a lot of us really like science, we like data, we want to talk about information. I'll give you another example. So if you look at the things that people worry about, you do surveys of the things that people are really concerned about, you get sort of one list of items. And then if you look at the things that people should be worried about, you get an entirely different list. And the problem is there's very little correlation between what we worry about and what we should worry about, but there's huge correlation between what we worry about, what we read about in the newspaper or we read online. We worry about what we're told to worry about. How could it be any different? Another example of how that plays out. If you look at the causes, where do people give money? On the left, we have all these different causes like breast cancer and others that receive a lot of funds. And then on the right are the things that kill us. Now, you might expect that there'd be a correlation between where we give our money and the things that kill us. But of course, the correlation is between the things that we hear about and we give to. If nobody comes to your door and asks for a donation, why would you send them a check? But if you hear about it on the news or NPR or the radio, you might think, oh, I should give those guys some money because it's a really important issue. So we focus on the things we're told to focus on. And we need to recognize that that's not other people's problems, it's how we all behave. And so we have to figure out ways, though, of demystifying food science, food policy in a way that engages and excites the public and doesn't turn them off and doesn't turn them against us. So I'm trying to find a way of making food less scary. Now, this is not my daughter, but it could be. She's not the most adventurous eater in the world. And I was giving this talk in Milan at the Milan Expo, and she was in the audience, and she's like, you don't use that slide when I'm not here, do you? I'm like, no, of course not. So again, don't tweet. She's on Instagram, she's not on Twitter, so that's okay. So how do we do that, though? How do we make food less scary? So how many people in the room have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? Please raise your hand. I am really surprised because the kiwi fruit is really pretty good. I'm sure it will make its way to Iowa eventually, my fingers are crossed. But how we talk about things matters because when it's a Chinese gooseberry, it's a hairy fruit. And when it's a kiwi, it is cute and fuzzy, right? Because back in 1910, some intrepid kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, brought it back, created a new variety, and most importantly, rebranded it. And the rest is history. How we talk about things matters, and we have to find better ways of talking about things. So I'll give you guys another example. You may have heard this idea that if a third grader can't pronounce it, you shouldn't put it in your mouth. And those of you who are scientists or married to a scientist like me, you're probably like, that's crazy, and there's chemicals in everything. You would beat them up with science. Or you could show them this slide and lead them to knowledge. People begin to realize that all of our food is filled with chemicals, and then they laugh and they smile and they kind of get it. They can't pronounce any of those things, but of course it's fine. So too often we beat people up with science instead of leading them to knowledge. How we communicate is what is really important. Now, sometimes I get the question, what is the scariest food you know? And I always say, the seedless watermelon. Unless I'm speaking to the seedless watermelon folks, and then I use a different example. You got to think about this. Where do they come from? They don't have any seeds. Kind of blows your mind. So I was wondering about this. So I did some research on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's true. You start with a watermelon, and it has 2 sets of chromosomes. And you're like, oh my God, it has chromosomes. No, that's okay. That's fine. And then you expose it to colchicine, which is a natural plant extract, which is highly toxic and mutagenic. I added the skull and crossbones, so you'll be more concerned. But that's okay. It now has 4 sets of chromosomes, and it still produces seeds. So what are you going to do? Well, now you cross that back with your original watermelon, and you end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up, it will not produce seeds. And that's the one you eat. No food safety evaluation, no nutritional analysis. That's conventional breeding, folks. Why aren't we worried about it? Well, because nobody's telling us to worry about it. We talk about putting one gene into a plant, and that seems scary. Well, what about adding an entire, another 50% more DNA? People are like, it had DNA? I don't do DNA, I'm sorry. And so, again, how we talk about these things matters. And I'm not trying to get you to stop eating seedless watermelons. I don't need hate mail from the seedless watermelon lobby. Those guys are vicious. So I have that disclaimer. We all agreed on that. So how do we make it more interesting and fun? And part of the problem, though, is that our brains are lying to us all the time. You cannot trust your brain. We have two parts to our brain. We have a fast-thinking part of our brain that sort of gets us through our day. It makes quick decisions. And we have a slow-thinking part of our brain that does the math and solves the hard problems. The problem is that slow-thinking part of our brain is super lazy. It will not do the math. It will not figure out the answer unless it has to. And most of the time, it doesn't know if it needs to do its job. So I'm going to give you guys some examples. The first is a visual illusion. We're all okay with visual illusions. They don't make us bad people. So when you look at these two squares, and you know this is a trick question already, which one looks darker? The one on the top or the bottom? How many people think the top square looks darker? Okay, that's good. You guys know I'm trying to trick you and your stories ran. Okay, so now we're going to pull out a couple of circles here and we're going to compare those two. And they look pretty similar. I know it's kind of hard to tell on the screen, so I'll cover it up. And of course, the color is the same. And I'm going to go back. What's happening here is that we've got two objects and our brain is telling us the one on the top is in the light. So it must actually be darker than it is because it's getting all this direct light and it looks like that. And our brain is then saying, the one on the bottom is in shadow. And so it must be brighter than it looks. And so our brain is automatically readjusting this to try to help us out in screwing us up. And so it doesn't matter, though, that you know that the color is the same. You can't see it as the same. And that's important because that's a quick decision. If somebody said, this is which one's darker, you'd raise your hand, you'd go on with your day, you never turn around and think about it. But this happens all the time. We make decisions, and it turns out we're entirely wrong, and we never stop to rethink. We never do the math. Now I'm going to ask you guys to do the math. So this is an easy problem. It's called the bat and the ball problem. Only a fifth grader could get it right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. That's okay. The smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. And I'm going to do the problem. I want you to shout out the answer as fast as possible. Otherwise, it's embarrassing to me. Okay, so a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
10 cents.
All right, 10 cents, maybe, right? Okay, so let's do the math. Bat and a ball together cost $1.10. If the ball cost 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, that would be $1.10. $1.10 plus 10 cents, that's 120. Ah, that's right. He was trying to trick us. He told the truth. So, of course, we can all do the math. 5 cents plus $1.05 is 110, but we generally don't. You go through your day making decisions that are important decisions, and you never bother to do the math. So it's important because these aren't things that other people do. These are things that we do every minute of every day. And if you don't understand your own biases, you can't talk to other people about theirs. So I'll give you some examples of confirmation bias. That's just the idea that we all look for something that's consistent with our view and we ignore data that's inconsistent. So I'm going to give you guys an example of my biases. So if I were to read a newspaper article that said organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what would I do? I would ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? All perfectly reasonable things to do. Now let's say that article said that organic agriculture is no more nutritious than conventional agriculture. What would I do? Tweet it, right? It's entirely consistent with what I believe. I'm sure those guys did a great job. So that's what bias looks like, not just being crazy and ignoring data that absolutely proves a point. It's scratching the surface and digging deeper on things that are inconsistent until you find that one grain that allows you to dismiss everything. Aha, that guy worked on an organic farm back when he was 12 years old. Totally biased. So we're looking for those things. So we need to understand, again, our own biases in order to engage with other people on theirs. So I'm going to give you another psychological characteristic, the availability heuristic. This one just says, how easy do certain things come to mind? So when I say the word natural, you guys are thinking of puppies and butterflies and Zika and Ebola and listeria, and like all the bad things in the world are natural too, but everybody thinks happy thoughts when I say the word natural. Do you want a natural product or an unnatural product? Everybody chooses the natural product. And so it's, again, not surprising that we do this. And now some of us may avoid labels that say natural because we feel like we're being manipulated. But we still feel that that's probably a good product. I'm just going to not buy it. So we can't avoid those immediate feelings and reactions. Now, we can have that slow thinking part of our brain course correct if it bothers to engage and wake up at all. But we need to understand that these are things that we all do. These aren't other people's problems. These are ours. So the biggest threat really to the future of the planet, it's this inability to work together to solve these problems. Because we have all of these tools at our disposal, and we have all of this innovation that's out there, and yet we're fighting over whether or not to allow anybody to use the tools instead of figuring out ways of moving forward. So some of the things that we need to do, whether we're scientists or work in companies or others, is that we all need to be better storytellers. And you have a great lineup of speakers today, and you'll get to hear lots of their stories. But what we all need to do is we need to personalize our messages. We need to acknowledge people's concerns. In 13 years at the State Department, I never once met a person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government or didn't trust big business, but they all love science. So when you say somebody is anti-science, that's like saying you're an idiot, but let's talk. It's not as persuasive as you might think. And so it's interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody from an organization that was very opposed to GMOs and explaining how I thought that organic agriculture and conventional and biotech could work together and all of these things. And at the end of it, she's like, you know, I'm surprised that somebody from the State Department has such a nuanced view, which was her way of saying you're not a complete idiot. And if you can take your biggest critic and get them to the point where they think you're not crazy, that's progress. I'll take it. So you got to find that way of reaching people and connecting on the things you can agree on, and then you begin to build trust. And it's only at the point that you have trust that science has any role to play in the conversation at all. So we need to get there, and we need to get there fast because the problems we face are big. Now, how many of you are familiar with pink slime, the lean, finely textured beef debacle of 2012? So just a recap for those who aren't. So there's a lean, finely textured beef is something that's collected off the bones of meat, and then it's repackaged and put back into meat to make it leaner and to filler. And so back in 2012, a mom in Texas found out about this lean, finely textured beef being in the burgers of the kids at the schools, and they started calling it pink slime. She started an online petition to get it out of the schools. Within a month, 3 of the 4 plants, including those in Iowa, who were producing this product, shut down. This issue was framed around health and safety. And who doesn't want to protect the health and safety of their children? On the other hand, because of that, all of that beef didn't become human food. And that's 400 to 700 million pounds of food that wasn't consumed. That's twice the food waste of Belgium in a given year. That might have been an issue we're talking about too. So about a year after that, there was this pop-up restaurant in New York called Wasted. And they had 20 celebrity chefs take the stuff that normally ends up in a trash can, turn it into beautiful dishes, and charge people $100 a plate to eat garbage. People loved it, right? You know, it's so exciting. I'm eating things that were really trash. And so this was framed around sustainability, though. And so instead of it being about health and safety, it's about sustainability. And so how we frame these conversations is really important, because if the lean, finely textured beef had been framed around sustainability, it would have won, because it's so important. These guys avoided throwing away 1,000 pounds of food. You know, that's good, but 700 million pounds is pretty good too. And it also gave people a cheaper product that was healthier and more nutritious, as opposed to a more expensive product. So how we talk about these things matters. In the US, we throw away about 48 billion pounds of food every year. That's a challenge. But there's technology. I don't know if you know about the innate potato from Simplot that's a non-browning potato. You also have the non-browning apples from our company. And these things seem like small technologies that aren't really important, but Potatoes are the second most wasted food item in America in most developed countries. Apples are the third most wasted food item. Bread is number one, if you're wondering. So it does matter. 40% of all apples are wasted. And so if you can get apples that don't bruise, every person who touches it in the supply chain can benefit. If you're a grower, less finger bruising. If you're a shipper or retailer, less loss. If you're a consumer and you have kids like me, the kids actually eat them when they get to school because they're not brown. And so everybody can benefit from these innovations, and they can help. So how do we talk about them, though, in a way that excites people of the opportunity instead of turning them off? So getting close to the end here, just to give you guys a little hope. I like to say that halfway through, just to give the organizers a good feeling. If we were going back to 1969, one of the things we might be talking about is the population bomb. And in that, the author was really concerned the population was growing so fast that that 1 billion people were going to be dying in India and Pakistan, and we should stop sending food aid, and they should consider forced sterilization. Those people are gone. We're just extending the misery if we send them food aid. Now, of course, that 1 billion people didn't die, and it's not because of the policies that were advocated in the book. It's because the Green Revolution was already well underway. And Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution from Cresco, Iowa, had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. So science and technology helped to avert that disaster. And I know that there are challenges with the Green Revolution, but I put 1 billion lives saved in the plus category. But people are still worried about the population growth and what it's doing and putting the pressure on resources. But really, if you look at the number of children being born, if you go back to 1950, the average woman had 5 children. In the developing world, it was 8 or 9. And today, it's a little over 2. So according to the Swedish statistician Hans Rosling, and I told you that I actually like statisticians, the year 2014 was the year of peak child. We heard about peak oil earlier. Peak child, the number of children born in 2014 was the most children that will ever be born in the history of the world in a given year. It's downhill after that. So you might be wondering, how can we go from 7 to 9 billion people if we're not having more kids? Well, that's all because people are living longer. It's a good news story. It's better health and nutrition. That's why a lot of us are still going to be there. That's a good thing in my category. I put that in the plus category as well. So it's also, though, why after 2050, population levels off so quickly, because we're not having more children. So here's what's interesting. If productivity can grow fast enough to keep us from screwing up the planet in 2050, and if we can maintain that productivity growth after 2050, for the first time in human history, we won't need more food. All of those productivity gains can go to reducing the impact of agriculture on the planet. Remember, between 1980 and 2011, we used 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. Well, imagine if between 2050 and 2100, we use 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. We'd use less water in 2100 to feed 11 billion people than we do today. We could take all of South America out of production. You guys would like that, right? We'd have choices, or we just produce everything organically. We'll have choices then in a way that we don't today. So we'll have this opportunity. But what it requires is that we get to 2050 without cutting down our forests and without draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Because if we do, we're good forever. The question, though, isn't, can agriculture save the planet? It can. The question is, will we be allowed to do it? I am a science optimist, and I'm a regulatory pessimist. I know that the people in this room and the companies you work with and the farmers that you work with can deliver those benefits. The question is, will they be allowed to? And they'll only be allowed to if people trust them with those tools to do that job. And so ultimately, it will all come down to whether or not this community is trusted to be the stewards of that future. We need the social license to do the things that are necessary in order to save the planet. So the thought I want to leave you with is, the next 35 years is not just the most important 35 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 35 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we have to get it right, and that's why this conversation is so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. We do have time for questions.
Sure.
Jack, I want to start here. You talked a lot about food waste and how it's imperative that we begin to reduce it. We're throwing away a lot of food. I hear that and I agree with it, right? That makes sense to me. Then I pulled up my phone and I looked at the wheat markets. Wheat markets are in the toilet. Bread's the most wasted food. I don't want people to keep their bread around. I want them to throw it out every day. How do we make the producer benefit by encouraging food saving rather than wastage?
So, it depends on which part of the supply chain you're doing that, right? So if you're looking at the potatoes from Simplot or our apples, the grower benefits from that as well. So one of the things Simplot has done is that they're reducing the amount of potatoes that are actually needed, but they're paying those farmers more. So that's one way that they're doing it. For us, our apple is a better apple, and there's going to be a premium, and the grower will participate in that benefit as well. And so, it depends. The challenge of agriculture when it comes to food waste is every single crop is different. Every product is different, and it's going to play out differently.
Okay. Yeah. All right, folks, do we have questions? Yes, please.
How close are we to clean meat or lab-growing meat becoming a viable option, and will the consumer actually accept the technology?
So that's a loaded question in this audience. If I say it's close and they're going to love it, you guys are going to start selling off land. So I think that most of the companies in the space, Memphis Meat, Mosa Meats, and others, would say they're about 5 years from having a commercial product. It's gone from $100,000 for a pound of meat to about $10,000. So they've made progress pretty quickly. I think the big challenge for them is not exactly consumer acceptance. It's consumer annoyance. Because right now, that sector to me is doing a terrible job of communicating what they do. Because the people that are funding that are by and large people with a vegan background. And because of that, their concern is that we're slaughtering 9 billion animals to feed 7 billion people every year. And so that's sort of the moral view that they bring to that. On the other hand, we need all the tools in our toolbox in order to solve the problems that we face. And the fact that some of the growth occurs from meeting that growing demand comes from lab-grown meat is fine, because we still need all of this other food as well, and people in other places are going to need more food as well. So there's an opportunity for all of them, but they need to not position themselves as opposed to conventional agriculture. They are doing themselves a disservice by undermining people's confidence. Because if you tell people you're a bad person if you eat a hamburger from a cow, those people aren't going to like you, because you're telling them they're bad people. And so I think we need to not communicate this in terms of morality, but in terms of, do people like that product or do they not like that product? Is it helping to create a more sustainable planet? Is it part of a food system, as opposed to pitting it against the food system?
It's interesting, the Impossible Burger, one of the meat substitutes made from plants, it's not truly lab-grown, was served in Davos at the World Economic Forum this week.
Right.
Which is heartbreaking to me as a cattle producer. Give them a corn-fed ribeye.
Exactly. Well, and they got themselves into trouble because they tried to say that they're non-GMO, even though the protein that gives the bloody feel to it, is produced with genetically engineered yeast. And it's not going to work if they're not going to be transparent about where their products are and what they do. And that's why, again, they're trying to align with foodies who don't like GMOs, so they're not telling people how their product is actually produced.
Huh. Do we have any other questions out there for Jack Bobo here? What's the future of soil quality, and do you see that as an issue?
Well, I see soil health as something that we're focusing on more and more. And to me, this is really that intersection of organic and conventional agriculture, because a lot of people think it's one or the other, but a lot of farmers are using low-till and no-till agriculture, and a lot of that started with organic farmers. And a lot of people are using cover crops today, and they're doing that because some organic farmer believed in her heart that it was the right thing to do, but now we have data to prove it. And so big data has made organic farmers better, but organic farmers have made everybody else better too, and focused on that. So I think that more of the crop chemicals and other things used are going to have a less and less of an impact on soil that's going to allow better and better soil health. But but we also need to spread that to the rest of the world. I mean, the U.S. soils, I think, are in pretty good shape and have great opportunity, but the rest of the world, is still losing soil at a really rapid pace. And so that's the problem. Things are getting better in some places, but not necessarily fast enough for the challenge we face.
All right. There's a question.
You talked about organic farming and conventional farming necessarily have to get along. But when organic farming's marketing pitch is that we are better than conventional farming, we are healthier,
Yep.
we are more sustainable, which is an absolute lie, how do we get along with organic farmers as conventional farmers when they're beating us down for their marketing system?
Right, and I think that that's an important conversation that needs to be had, not just with those farmers, but with the federal government as well. That truth in advertising. A lot of labels say no pesticides, but we know that what they really mean is no synthetic pesticides, and so that's already a bit of misleading. But I think that that's part of it, is that we need to actually address some of the misinformation that's being pushed out there in marketing that is inconsistent with current law. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are happening that are not. And so if we could have a more serious conversation about what should you actually be allowed to say, I mean, that's why just the word natural doesn't really mean anything and probably shouldn't be allowed on any packaging. And you can buy veggie chips that are really just potato chips with a little tomato flavoring, right? And that's called a vegetable. And so I think that there's a lot that needs to be done to look at how some of this marketing is happening. But it's not everybody in the organic movement that's doing that, right? I mean, it's a small segment that's having a very big outsized impact, because a lot of you or a lot of the farmers that you work with are probably growing organic crops and biotech crops on the same farm. So there's a broad diversity of folks that are part of the organic food movement as well. And those are the conversations we really need to have, because they are important. Thanks. All right.
All right. Well, now let's thank Jack Bobo with a big round of applause. Fantastic. Thank you, sir.